Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with part 11, Dante Alighieri, from the Orders of the Quest The Holy Grail by Manly P. Hall. Dante Alighieri, Gabriele Rossetti, 1783 to 1854, was among the victims of the revolutionary changes in Italy. He fled from Naples and settled in England, where he became professor of the Italian language and literature in King's College, London. He was the father of Dante Gabriele Rossetti, 1828 to 1882, English poet and pre-Raphaelite painter. Both father and son were enthusiastic Dantephilists, but it was the elder Rossetti whose contributions have made the most direct bearing upon the descent of the esoteric tradition. The vast and varied lore which he brought to bear on the more recondite sense contained in the Divine Comedy and in the lyrics of Dante and his contemporaries will remain a memorial of literary labor and loving perseverance. Professor Rossetti was convinced that the poet Dante was a member of a secret society, and that his verses concealed a hidden meaning which had escaped the notice of earlier commentators or which they had intentionally ignored. The substance of his researches and the conclusions derived therefrom he published in London, 1832, under the title thus: Professor Rossetti includes Petrarch and Boccaccio among the number of the initiated Italians, but does not devote so much attention to their writings. The researches of the elder Rossetti are of special interest when we realize that they were in print long before the concept of the descent of a secret doctrine through European schools of Adepts had any prominent exponents or apologists. He therefore anticipated by some 50 years the convictions of the Theosophical Society and the schools of philosophic mysticism, which emerged in the last quarter of the 19th century. It will be well to summarize the Rossetti hypothesis. Even though his observations overlap to some degree material we have already advanced, to facilitate our ends, we shall have recourse to the Remarks on the Disquisition, London 1832, by author Henry Hallam. A secret society, according to Rossetti, whose original is lost in the mystery twilight of Oriental religion, has continued from the earliest historical point at which its workings can be traced to exercise an almost universal influence on the conduct of the civilized world. These mysteries, which in Egypt, in Persia, and even Greece and Italy, preserved the speculation of the wise from the ears and tongues of an illiterate multitude, passed with slight but necessary modifications into the possession of the early Christian heretics. The Gnostic schools of Syria and Egypt transmitted to their successors, the Manichaeans, a scheme of discipline, which they perpetuated with extreme caution and in the most veiled language, as secrecy became more and more necessary because of the increased centralization of power in the Orthodox prelates in Rome. The Polychaeans, whose opinions were for the most part Manichaean, preceded the most illustrious and more unfortunate Albigenses in a secret warfare against spiritual as well as temporal tyranny. The celebrated order of the Templars, so widely diffused throughout Europe, so considerable by the rank and influence of its members, did not differ from the Albigenses in the secret objective of their endeavors, or the more important part of their mysterious rites. The rise of new literature in the 11th and 12th century, explains Rossetti, afforded them a new weapon far more terrible than any they had hitherto employed, and capable of being directed to 1,000 purposes of attack and defense. No path of literature has been untrodden by these masked assailants. In poetry and romance and history and science, everywhere we find traces of their presence, their influence in some sphere or other has been exerted on all nations. The love poems and love courts of Provence and Toulouse were vehicles of political discussions, of active conspiracy, and of heretical opinion. The poet Dante was an initiate of this secret political society, philosophical and religious society, a champion of its means and ends. The proof is concealed in his Vita Nova, the Divine Comedy and its commentaries in the Convito, the Di Bulgari, Eloquenta, and others of his minor works. Petrarch and Boccaccio were agents of the same mysterious institution, and its rites and secrets can also be discovered by those having the proper key to the confused writings of Baron Emanuel Swedenborg. Needless to say, the Solo Spirito, etc. created a minor tempest in the intellectual world. Author Hallam, speaking for all the skeptics, pronounces the ideas which it contains interesting, ingenious, and impossible. Let us bear in mind, however, the Professor Rossetti, himself a political exile, was nourished from childhood upon the pabulum of Italian socialistic idealism and secret assemblages. Both Petrarch and Dante admired Arnaldo Daniello, one of the most obscure of the Provençal poets. They called him the Great Master of Love, but no one understood his songs, although it is known that he was a troubadour. It is impossible to examine Le Roman de la Rose without realizing that it refers to an esoteric fraternity. The mystical import of the rose symbol of the minstrels is certainly reflected in the rose of Dante, the rose eternal that spreads and multiplies in the seventh heaven, where the blessed Beatrice is enthroned. From the Divine Comedy, Firenze, 1892, Dante Alighieri. Madame Blavatsky contributes some pertinent observations. To genius alone it was permitted in those centuries of mental blindness, when the fear of the Holy Office threw a thick veil over every cosmic and psychic truth, to reveal unimpeded some of the greatest truths of initiations. Whence did Ariosto, in his Orlando Furioso, obtain his concept of the Valley of the Moon, where after our death we can find the ideas and images of all that exists on earth? How came Dante to imagine the many descriptions given in his Inferno, a new Johannine apocalypse, a true occult revelation in verse, his visit and communion with the souls of the seven spheres? In poetry and satire, every occult truth has been welcomed. None has been recognized as serious. Dante Alighieri, 1265 through 1321, was born in Florence of a respectable but not especially illustrious family. Little is known of his early life except that he met the little girl whom he called Beatrice when he was about 10 years old and she was in her 9th year. It has seemed reasonable to assume from Dante's poetic work and his letters that his infatuation for Beatrice, vice Forte Mari, was the dominant personal emotion in his life. She selected Simon de Bardi for a husband, however, and died before reaching middle age. In 1292, Dante married, and the union was blessed with 2 sons and 1 or 2 daughters. Although Dante involved many of his acquaintances and enemies, at least indirectly, in his poems, no line or passage has been found which seems to allude to his wife. Beatrice remains to the end the mistress of his heart and soul. For his involvements in the political conspiracies of the day, Dante was exiled from his beloved Florence and spent the closing years of his life at Ravenna. He died of a fever, consoled by the mystical philosophy which had come to dominate his entire mind. Although Dante's fame is derived principally from his Divine Comedy, for our purposes the Vita Nova links him most closely to the mystical speculations of the troubadours. The Vita Nova explains how the poet, meeting Beatrice while still a child, concealed his true love or mystical adoration by inviting a false love or human affection. Later, after Beatrice had died, she appeared to him in a vision, persuading him to devote his life to study and reflection, thus proving his eternal devotion. From the Divine Comedy, Firenze, 1892, the cosmogony of Dante's Divine Comedy. We should certainly feel grateful, wrote Hallam, for any theory that should satisfactorily explain the Vita Nova. No one can read that singular work without having found its progress perpetually checked and his pleasure impaired. But the occurrence of passages apparently unintelligible or presenting only an unimportant meaning in phrases the most laborious and involved, certainly until Signor Rossetti suggested the idea. We never dreamed of looking for Ghibellin's enigmas in a narrative apparently so remote from politics. Let us compare Hallam's negative notions with the more positive attitude revealed in the writings of the distinguished Masonic scholar, General Albert Pike. He wrote nearly 40 years after Professor Rossetti, and with all the love of Freemasonry at his command, arrived at almost identical conclusions. Commentaries and studies have been multiplied upon the Divine Comedy, the work of Dante, and yet no one, so far as we know, has pointed out its especial character. The work of the Ghibellin is a dedication of war against the papacy. By bold revelation of the mysteries, the epic of Dante is Johannine and Gnostic, an audacious application like that of the Apocalypse of the figures and numbers of the Kabbalah to the Christian dogmas, and a secret negation of everything absolute in these dogmas. His journey through the supernatural world was accomplished like the initiation into the mysteries of Eleusis and Thebes. He escapes from the gulf of hell over the gate of which the sentence of despair was written, by reversing the positions of his head and feet, that is to say, by accepting the direct opposite of the Catholic dogma. And then he ascends to the light, by using the devil himself as a monstrous ladder. Pike also points out that the Divine Comedy was based on the allegorical table of Cebes, and was the allegorical formula of the great secrets of the Society of the Rose Croix. The primary difficulty that confronts the interpretations of Dante is the confusion caused by historical and symbolical Beatrice. Unimaginative commentators cannot appreciate the entire reasonable process of using an actual person to personify a spiritual truth. Yet Dante's personal acquaintance with a lady was slight, and his use of her in this mystical writing occurs only after her death. Certainly Dante did not intend to imply that he actually wondered about heaven and hell with Virgil as an all-sufficient guide. If the poet could involve himself in an allegory, why could he not also involve Beatrice? Nor is it more difficult to include Petrarch's passion for his mysterious Laura, or Boccaccio's erotic devotions in the same category. We concede that the transcendental import of Boccaccio's Decameron is not immediately apparent, but neither are the true meanings of Don Quixote, de la Mancha, and Gulliver's Travels. We agree with Bacon that he who cares for nothing but resemblance finds them in every hole and corner, and takes them on trust when he cannot find them. We must not build too much upon the uncertain foundation of coincidence. But on the other hand, we cannot afford to overlook circumstantial evidence when it is present in sufficient amount. There can be no reasonable doubt that the mystical rose of Apuleius, the alchemical rose of Flamel, the troubadour rose of Jean de Meung, and the cosmic rose of Dante grew on a single stem. Dante was certainly an initiate of the interior empire of the poets, and his allegories are no more fantastic than Trajano Buccolini's description of the universal reformation of mankind. Beatrice is the virgin of the world and, like the dark lady of Shakespearean sonnets, represents eternal truth for which all men pine away in hopeless adoration. Yet, inspired by this unattainable perfection, each embarks upon a knight-errantry of noble pursuit, the fair maiden in distress, who must be rescued from giants, ogres, dragons, and tyrants, is humanity itself, the collective soul, victim of the conspiracies of church and state. This is the simple part of the story. The program for the accomplishment of sacred and civil liberty was in the keeping of those initiates who had bound themselves with a secret and soul-consuming passion to the service of the veiled Virgin of the Mysteries. From the Order of the Garter, by Elias Ashmole. The Chancellor's Badge. The rose emblem of the Brotherhoods of the Quest is represented surrounded by the Band of the Garter and the motto of the Order. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.